Good morning, my friends. This is the Fat Man. One could almost say this is breakfast with the Fat Man, which I do every now and then. More or less coffee right now. It is not quite 8 o'clock. I think it's closer to probably closer to 7:30. I am sitting at the behind a restaurant and waiting for the crew to show up to open the doors so I can go do my job and move on to my next job for the day. The topic of my current set of video blogs is Star Trek, and as I said, there is a good reason for it. I am in a process of beginning to revisit my vast collection of Star Trek, and in tandem with that, I thought there's some things on my opinions on Star Trek in general that are worth video recording and sharing with you. And if you disagree with me, that's so be it. If you don't, so be that too. The sun isn't quite up, so it's still dark. You can see it coming up a bit over my shoulder a little bit here. I did actually manage to find out how to get my lighting in my cab to work. I had to change a couple fuses. The marked fuse that they used needs to be twice as strong as the one that's actually the one that they got marked. So surprise, surprise. I also don't have any heat yet. We're waiting on parts from Japan for that. It could be a couple more weeks before they show up. Hoping it stays in the 50s and 60s like it's been. But that's neither here nor there. I think I did a previous video on the topic of militarizing Starfleet some months back, could be a year ago, and I still believe that. And I think that if you read between the lines, I don't know, if you're a diehard Trekkie fan, you'll notice that despite the Federation, especially Earth's high ideals and exploration and negotiation and diplomacy, we have this tendency to keep running into problems called alien races who want to domineer, destroy, or otherwise eliminate, mess with that philosophy. And so the fact that there's this almost naivety to a portion of the Starfleet Command and a portion of the Federation government that refuses to acknowledge, despite the fact that everything from Roddenberry's canon to the newer canon to the Calvin canon all pretty much show the same thing. That everything out there in the galaxy is in conflict of one sort or another and are not adverse to, ganging up on or trying to overwhelm somebody lesser than themselves. The Vulcans, for a very logic-based society, were quite aggressive in their military tactics, and logically so. So they made a fairly potent Starfleet of their own at the time, prior to the Federation being formed. The Andorians had that was their thing. The Terralites were merchant marines, so to speak, more merchant than fighter, but everybody had their problems. And we look at the early history of Star Trek, hinted upon in Gene Roddenberry's TV series, where there was almost constant conflict, low level, between the Romulans and between the Klingons and the Federation. And then there were known conflicts between those superpowers. The Romulans and the Klingons had conflicts in the past, and then they've had negotiated peace. They've had trade agreements, which were then broken, and then more aggression, and then there's a repeat. And then we see the same thing in some of the other larger diverse races. Any significant spacefaring race in Star Trek has had a conflict with somebody else at one time or another. And then there's references, in an attempt from the early writer's perspective of chasing Roddenberry's dream or his instruction to show the follies of war. We see a number of those TV series shows in the original series where they talk about, what happens when a race gets out of hand, or when superpower mindset gets out of hand. Nuclear holocaust can devastate planets or entire solar systems. Look, the Doomsday Device is an example, and the episode where the two-part episode where the two last remaining male members of their species were in conflict because one side was black and one side was white and the other side was black, blah blah blah. It was just an obvious attempt to try to show the hypocrisy and to show the ludicrousy of our mindset in the 70s when the TV series was created. And I laud him. And so after Gene Roddenberry more or less was retired, the TV executives and the public, the consumer, wanted something else. And so we've seen an increasingly militant issue. So when the Next Generation came along, it began like the old TV series, but by the second or third season, it became very obvious that they were being involved in many large possible conflicts and conflicts between these space-going races in the Federation. And we dug it as the customer. That is what we wanted, because we watched. DS9 came along and it was even more aggressive, because we saw ourselves, in the beginning, toward the end of the Next Generation, we started seeing encounters with the Borg and with problems with the Klingons. We even seen that towards the end of the original crew, when more or less the Klingon Empire supposedly fell apart, which never truly happened. They lost their major production of fuel for their ships when a moon exploded, but the Klingon Empire is vast. Holds hundreds of systems, thousands of planets, perhaps tens of thousands of moons. I'm sure they have more fuel sources. Just saying, right? And it was a philosophy of the Cold War coming to an end kind of mindset, that this constant aggressive tendencies of Klingons was going to be the end of them. And yet we see in later TV series and movies that the Klingons, time and time again, are some of the best allies, the most aggressive allies the Federation have. And I'm just saying. So we saw the Borg, and then we saw the Dominion War. And we've seen a few other things tossed in between. And now we've got this discovery, and there's this war between the human Federation, the humans, the Federation in general, and the Klingons. And Enterprise, it was the Zaringi or whatever, and then there was the Time War, which kind of confused the hell out of a lot of us. And then there's the nascent beginnings of conflict between us and the Federation and the Russians, and the Romulans and the Federation and the Klingons. So time and time again, it's shown that the Federation is going to have more than its share of problems. So we look at Starfleet and we look at the ship designs, and if you're an old hat, if you're an old gamer and with Star Trek, an old Star Trek game, and you've got FASA, or you got some other stuff that allowed you to play Star Trek, there was this Starfleet, the Cadet Manual, the Starfleet Cadet Manual, I think is what it's called, and it was put out in the 70s, the first edition. And a friend of mine's brother had it, and I kept flipping through it whenever I got the opportunity. And then as soon as I got a chance, I bought a later version of it, which I have someplace in my storage. I was trying to find it yesterday, and it didn't have any success. And my wife was kind of agitating to get on with the day, and she didn't like me digging through, my collection of books, because I don't know, I tend to get sidetracked pretty easily on those things. And I know I've got it because I would like to do a review on it. Partly because it shows that from the earliest concepts that we have a more aggressive Starfleet and more aggressive Star Trek than what is portrayed by Gene Roddenberry's canon, right? I'm just saying. Okay. So, we look at the ship designs. The original Enterprise was a heavy cruiser. An exploration vessel designed to travel for a great distance for doing 5-year missions without needing to be technically resupplied. You would be deployed to the farthest reaches of human Federation reach, and then try to expand, and with the concept of expanding the borders and exploring the unknown, encountering new races. So you needed a big ship, had plenty of room, plenty of supply capacity, and needed to be able to defend itself in most situations, right? So it makes sense. So why call it a heavy cruiser? Because, and you know the answer to this, yes you do, because we have light cruisers, we have destroyers, we have escorts, we have a plethora of ship types, scouts, what have you. And depending on the era and the situation during that era, Starfleet evolved and de-evolved and evolved and de-evolved. And at some point they realized, we're going to basically build a weaponized ship of war designed for exploration and scientific research. Okay, and we'll just avoid calling it a heavy cruiser to anybody else. It just is what it is, but we call it that for ourselves. And as weapons ships go, the original Star Trek Enterprise had 6 banks of pretty potent phasers and a pair of forward and rear firing photon torpedo launchers. Pretty respectable firepower. And then later versions have even more potent defenses, offensive capability, and then of course powerful shields and some in later ships, blade of armor and other additions to make them more survivable in a conflict. It's not until we get into the latter part of DS9 do we start to see true interstellar conflict on a vast scale, where hundreds of ships, thousands of ships on both sides collide in these massive armadas, and huge amounts of destruction are dumped on each other. I have some opinions on that too. It looks really, really good in the series, but in reality, I don't think either side would have functioned that way. This all or nothing, we're going to mass the lion's share of our bulk of our forces in one big, huge armada and flinging it at the other guy. That's so archaic. It doesn't make sense to me. But we're not talking tactics here, are we? I think that as a player, as a GM, when I played FASA, we tend to play it on the more aggressive side. We tend to feed into this militaristic mindset. So yes, we were explorers, yes, we were diplomats, but to paraphrase Teddy Roosevelt, talk softly but carry a big stick, and there's a good reason for it. It's an aggressive galaxy out there. Something to think about, something to consider. Until next time, this is the Fat Man, and game on!